It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Mark McDonough, and we're going to be talking about his excellent book, Forged Through Fire, a reconstructive surgeon's story of survival, faith, and healing. Mark, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Shaun. It's a pleasure to be here and glad to be connected.
Yes, truly my pleasure. Several of my friends, John Burke, Randy Kay, had spoken so highly of you. I was like, man, I got to get Mark on my podcast as well. I was feeling left out because I haven't had my part in sharing your story. But since this is more of a biographical memoir, we're telling your story journey. I'm going to skip my traditional opening of the origin story question. And I'd like to start this interview by talking a little bit about your writing experience, writing journey. Before the interview, you were sharing with me that you've been a writer, you enjoy writing, but in terms of, I'm assuming you shared this story, your story, bits and pieces of it with people through the years. What was it like to actually have to put it down, knowing this was going to go into a book that's going to be seen by thousands of people? Talk to us a little bit about what was good, what was challenging, what that looked like for you.
It was an entirely different process than it was telling the story over the years. The story didn't change a lot, but I did as I grew and matured. My perspectives did, and the parts of it that I felt were germane may have changed a little bit. But as it played out, the journey itself didn't change. But when I began to write about it, it became an entirely different process, certainly therapeutically, in one sense, because also I love writing from the time I was a youngster. My grandmother was an English teacher, so she and my dad were always correcting our grammar growing up, and I always respected the word. And when I had essays and papers to write, I found it very enjoyable. But in writing, because I enjoyed writing and respect the process, I was particular and almost obsessive about word choice and descriptions, and wanted it to be clear, but also wanted it to be me and from the heart. But I didn't realize from the heart how much that aspect would be an emotional process. Everybody said, well, it must be therapeutic. And I didn't appreciate that until having gone all through the process. There were days that I didn't understand why my emotions felt so twisted. And then, my wife or someone would say, well, what were you working on? Or something would remind me of where I was in the process. And I could see how therapeutic is an accurate word it toyed with me in many different ways. I experienced extremes of joy and extremes of sadness for probably a couple of years. When it was accepted for publication and I had deadlines, I really started focusing more on how the word, how tight it was, and if it was telling the story without being too verbose. And so that made me really stay in touch with the feeling, and the emotion that would attract a reader, I hoped. But it was enjoyable for sure. I was so glad that I did it. And it also reminded me that how much I enjoy writing and should spend more time doing that. And because my career was allowing it at that time, plus it was something non-scientific. I hadn't written something like a memoir or even a fictional, other than poems and song lyrics. For probably 10 or 20 years, if I were writing, it was more focused on a scientific thing or a presentation or paper publication. So it was a stimulating and inspiring process all in one.
And the book's been out for a few years, and I'm curious in terms of when readers respond to you or somehow connect with you, what part of your journey do they actually bring up or ask you about? Because you cover so many things throughout the book that I think various people are going to identify. You've got just your recovery following the fire. You have a near-death experience. You have rhythms of overcoming addiction, and so there's a lot for people to pull on and relate to. So when people encounter you, is there one or two things that they often comment on?
That's that's true and interesting that I hadn't thought of it in that way. But those that have been most uh, have made a concerted effort to reach me and make sure I understood that. Oh, when they read, there were several of those experiences, and they were varied. My son was the one I refer to most often because he's my oldest son, uh, oldest of three boys, is not usually expressive, or I say he doesn't throw kudos out randomly. And when he got around to reading it, it had probably been out for almost a year. Yeah, it came out in the fall, and it was that spring when he sat down to read it, but called me one day and said, dude, I can't believe this. I keep having to remind myself, this is my dad I'm reading about. Like, this is just, I can't, blowing my mind. And so in his sense, he couldn't believe he even said, it feels like a Hollywood screenplay or movie script. Whereas there were certain colleagues who said, wow, how did you handle when you recognized um, the problem with alcohol, just cut it out of your life. And in that sense, people were interested in more in the recovery aspect of alcoholism and the recovery network, or those in the profession, because there are a lot of medical professionals with impairment issues and that have altered their careers. Um, from some younger folks, I talked about my fears of dying when I had Guillain-Barré and being in the hospital, unable to visit with my mom because they didn't have a pediatric unit that allowed parents to visit. And that was really scary. But it's true, Shaun. There's a topic for discussion. Probably at 6 or 7 stages of the book. But I guess it's been that kind of a journey. I mean, every time I think it's going one way, it certainly, and I'm not the first to say that, but from no interest in science to then being so far into medicine that I chose the hardest residency to finish, and um, we never know where God's going to take us. It's just in my case, um, when I think the journey is going to slow down, or I'm an even keel, something else happens to throw me in disarray, or God's always got another challenge or another unexpected turn in the course. No boredom, that's for sure.
Yes, yes. We were chatting about this before the interview. That is, as we learn to yield and God directs our paths in places we didn't see, and there's a lot of surprises along the journey, to say the least. I think the place I'd love to go next is just take us into kind of your family. Introduce us to your kind of, I guess, sort of set the stage of who you guys were, how people knew you and thought of you guys, sort of kind of pre the fire. Like, were you a typical American family?
Well, yes and no. I was the oldest of 5 boys, and my parents were both raised Christian in Christian families and households. Um, my parents were not rigid, but they were strict, and there were rules to follow, and everybody had routines. Everybody contributed. We had chore lists, and Saturday mornings chores needed to be completed before you go out and play with your friends. And I remember church and some aspect of organized um, spirituality was consistently part of our lives. When we went from from Catholic to public school system, we continued with catechism once a week. But our parents were not um, Bible thumping or really strict from a moral standpoint, but they were liberal in allowing us to discuss or question or challenge family tenets or rules and that kind of thing. But they certainly had expectations. They tried to encourage us in our, social lives or our hobbies and extracurricular activities, but they weren't demanding in terms of mandating that we pursue one direction or another. I was interested in sports, but not, the best jock in class, or I was kind of the middle in just about everything. I had a strong interest in music, so I played musical instruments, and my brothers followed suit. My next youngest brother and I had a band all the time in junior high and high school, and we both played on recreational football, and I played on the football team in high school or junior high and high school, and then I broke my toes twice, so that kept me out of pursuing that. But we were also all five avid swimmers, competitive swimmers, so we swam on the school team or a country club team in the summers, and we were often doing water activities or outdoor activities. My dad was a big outdoor person too, so he encouraged that kind of thing.
And I don't know, you don't have to go too much at length into the fire. I mean, as much as you want to share, but I guess give the people some context for
Sure.
what happened. How did it start? So if I remember correctly, you guys had recently moved into a new house.
Right. Well, not recently, but when I was 9, we moved into the house that my dad built. He designed and built. Um, and so it was still, I guess it's relatively new, certainly. And we were always doing different things or modifications to it. But it was a two-story colonial home. And we had just come home from a family vacation. And in terms of family dynamics, there was a lot. We were with the three older of the five boys, all in their teens. We had some rebellious attitudes, some contentious issues with both mom and dad. And they were usually in terms of things like curfew, and the kinds of kids we were hanging out with. And did we know, or were we mature enough to decide who's appropriate, who's not, that kind of thing. But I know there was also a lot of peer pressure to drink on weekends and to smoke cigarettes, and all three of the older boys at various times were caught experimenting or out with kids smoking cigarettes or that kind of thing. In 7th grade, a lot of kids were experimenting with pot, and I know my brothers and I did that too. So, but at the time, my parents were very open-minded about it. I remember they found some marijuana one time in a stash somewhere, and so my dad had a family powwow, and we all sat down and shared honestly, openly with them that our friends had smoked pot. And of course, we were from the party that said there's no worries whatsoever, it's completely harmless. Whereas today we understand that can interfere with maturation and emotional growth. But there were liberal years in the 60s, 70s. And I know before the fire, though, we had taken this vacation so that Dad could try to get us more united and on an equal front. And it was the first vacation we'd taken as a family, all 7 of us. But he rented a motorhome. We were going to go to various places on the East Coast, including his and my mother's alma mater, Miami of Ohio. And then we were going to go down as far as Key West with stops at Disney World. And it was a fun yet stressful vacation. I know both of my parents drank, and so alcohol was beginning to interfere with the family dynamics, at least on the part of my dad. But there was some fighting and some bickering. I know we got into a big argument at Disney World about something foolish, and the youngest, Toby, yelled at me, "Oh, Mark, now we're not going to see Mickey Mouse." And because Dad was saying we shouldn't even bother going to the park. I mean, it's a typical family quarrel kind of thing. But in any event, we worked through a lot of things, and it turned out in the big picture to be a really positive experience, and one I'm grateful that my dad did and had the foresight to have us all to take this vacation. Who knew it would be the last family vacation? And gosh, we had no idea. But upon getting home, we realized that someone had broken into the home, or some kids had. It looked like some people had broken in and had a party and broken into the liquor cabinet and did some minor damage. But there were also things stolen. The silver was stolen, and my electric guitar, and some things of value. And Mom was trying to settle the claims with the insurance company on the day of the fire. But Dad had gone on to town that day to San Francisco. The first time he was traveling that far from Ohio. His usual territory included the East Coast and Boston area. He regretted having to go to San Francisco, having just gotten back from this vacation, and was going out to see some new clients. And um, we had just bought smoke detectors to install in the home, as a matter of fact, and didn't have the right kind of lithium battery. That little thing that looks like a disc at the time was a real new technical advancement for us. And I remember they were out on the side counter, and Dad had said, "We'll get those installed as soon as I get back," because we had tried to install them the night before and couldn't get them to work. And uh, just the irony in that. But he was out of town and had said, take care of your mom and brother's chum, and see you when I get back. And that night was my night off from a restaurant, the Brown Derby Steakhouse is where I worked in high school. And that was a usual thing. I mean, I worked from the ninth grade through high school at a part-time job usually. And Dad always felt we should try to help contribute to saving for our education. And even when we were in college, as long as we were working part-time or making an effort toward that, he was helpful. And but I always liked having a job, so I had some extra cash and some sense of control. But in any event, it was my night off from the steakhouse with my best friend Tweeter, and he and I were washing dishes there. He was working that night, and I was off, so I'd been out with friends, just visiting, and different places around town. But I got home 12:30 or 1 that night, had a glass of milk, and shortly after hitting the sack, woke up to this incredible sense of heat, and just that it, like I was in the middle of an oven, and I could see a faint orange glow. And it didn't take long to recognize what was happening, but I started screaming to my brothers to get out. My brother Tim shared my room, and my brothers Dan and Packy were across the hall, but at the same side of the house. So they all began getting out their windows, their individual windows, respectively. Tim jumped 2 stories down, and Packy was climbing out a 2-story window. Dan went out onto the garage roof, and I went straight across the hall to try to get out the bathroom window, but first to get some air, because I knew my mother's room had access from a balcony or a sun deck in the back. And so I punched through that window to get air, but then I couldn't get out of it because I'd knocked it out of its tracks. And then turning to leave the bathroom, I stumbled partway down the stairs, which at that point were acting like an inferno chimney for the flames that were just bellowing up through the hallway and then up the stairwell. But the other incredibly, the frightening thing was the sound, the noise, the volume of crackling of wood and paper tearing, and the flames, raping the surface off the all the wood trim and the walls and the wallpaper. And it sounded like a tornado. I've seen or heard tornadoes twice since that time, and or a train, like right next to a train blowing by me. And that noise was so loud, but also it was like being in an oven. I've described it in the book as like basting a turkey and standing in there with the door locked and no way to get out. And nothing, every slight inspiration was just charring the inside of my throat and lining. So I knew I had to get some air or pass out, but it really felt as though I were suffocating or underwater, and unable to see as I fell down the stairs. The front door was right at the foot of the stairs, so I knew I could get out and maybe come back up the back stairwell or back balcony. And the door was metal to be burglar proof, and it expanded in the heat. We learned later, fire inspectors had said it had probably expanded and wouldn't open from the jam. But I leaned in against, or pulled and pulled, throwing all my body weight in the opposite direction, but couldn't get it open. Made a split-second decision to go toward the back door of the house, but that meant running right by where the fire started in the family room, and having to, the flames were billowing out of that room and then up the stairwell. So I put my hands over my face and just ran quickly to the back door, where a fireman later found me. And he said that he'd had a premonition it was a human body blocking his entry. So his perseverance allowed him to get in and push me out of the way from the door so that they could pull me out. I remember starting to get dizzy and lose consciousness, but the next thought I had, or conscious thought, was in the ambulance. And the first one was not being certain what had happened. For a millisecond or two, I thought I was in a terrible, terrible accident, but couldn't remember what happened. But then everything came back instantly. My attempt at escaping, and all I could say was, "Mom and Toby, did they get out? Did they get out?" And they wouldn't answer me. The paramedics were focused on trying to get IV started. And I heard them say over the radio, "If he's badly burned, go straight to Metro." But they stopped first at the hospital where I was born, a little community hospital, and they needed more saline. And they were pouring saline over my body. And so it was freezing cold, but I was shivering and screaming to God to please take me, end this. I can't take one more second of this, yet one more second would transpire. And I just kept trying to talk to the paramedics, but they were so focused on what they were doing. And every jar would tear into my back and my shoulders and my legs and my hips. And I kept, as the ambulance turned and started, next thing I know, the bright lights of the emergency room, trauma bay, are in my eyes, and there's 15 people surrounding me and sitting me up and slamming me back down and sitting me up, trying to put X-ray plates behind my back. And I kept asking about Mom and Toby. No one would answer questions, and I right away felt that the terror and utter fear of being surrounded by terrorists in white and green. And I think, years later, as I looked back, and again, the writing process brought back ways that probably old experiences in my childhood were triggering incredible adrenaline surges, not to mention the injury itself. 65% of my body had been burned, 2/3 of which was full thickness requiring skin grafting. But initially, the large burn or trauma victim in fires is high risk for death because of fluid loss. On the part of the medical and clinical folks, their concern is to keep enough fluid going so that none of my major organs shut down, and they've got to get that fluid going. The sooner, the better. Within seconds of sustaining the injury, because all that skin essentially is now an open wound that's just oozing all of my internal fluids, and all the nerve endings are exposed because that skin's been removed. So there's the pain and there's the immediate physical concern to keep fluids moving. And that entire experience, I think, was compounded by the fear that I was not among friends. I was just being attacked. And I remember I made a derogatory comment to a minority, and somebody started lecturing me about I just how you behave and how you communicate with us. We're here to help you. It's not the other way around. And, this is how it's going to go. This is how it's going to be. And so I was put on the defense right away. but I understand completely as a physician today. I've been in that same situation with the roles reversed and can see how I was a fearful, demanding young teenage boy who's mad now at God because how could this happen to me? I mean, I was doing the right thing and just at the wrong place in the wrong time. And God, take me away from this pain, save me, please come to my rescue. And one more minute would pass on. Very frightening. Many times in the trauma bay as a physician, as a trauma surgeon, I went through that scenario in my mind just because it became a matter of habit and routine. That one of my own chairmen said that he couldn't imagine being a trauma surgeon having sustained any kind of trauma because he'd think he'd be so scared he'd be unable to function. But I think that there's something that happens to some of us that just it's I get maybe the fear or the challenge or the survivor gene, I call it. But regardless of how big the challenge, I'm still going to fight as hard as I can fight. And it's not, I don't know if it's well, I just think the compounding of the experience and the experiences that I'd had as a youngster probably exponentially dramatized that whole ER bay, trauma bay experience that now has been repeated, but from the other side of the table so many times in my life. It's easier for me to see it more clearly now. But
And I'll say, just in my experience, having worked with so many authors to tell their stories and having interviewed so many people through the years, it's often those places where God drew us close in our own journey, and there's been a victory or an overcoming, that's exactly the place that God will ask us to work and do ministry or whatever that looks like. But I always find like that deep place where we had to draw so close to God in our life is that place where I feel like that's where we can have empathy for others and we can relate and help others. And so I guess to some degree, I'm in that, from that perspective, I might not be all that surprised just at your career path as that emerged. In terms of from when the fire happened, you're in the ER. Like what's the time span from that to when you have the surgery where you have your near death experience? How long was the time frame between those two?
well, it was exactly 10 days because August 3rd was the fire. 10 days, it probably felt like a million days, but really wasn't that long if I think about it. But interesting, during that whole 10 days, all I can remember thinking is, how could God let this happen? How could God, when they finally said that Toby didn't survive, I couldn't believe it. Six is innocent 6-year-old boy. And then when they said mom was finally taken off the ventilator on August 5th. And so her official death occurred on August 5th, which was significant to me because it would be 40 years later, or 30 years later in 1995, on the anniversary of her death, when I suffered a stroke. But I remember during those 10 days thinking, how could God let this happen? And my dad seeing me the first time, I was so swollen, like the Pillsbury Doughboy, just wrapped in gauze and twice my size because my body was ballooning and bloated from fluid, my face swollen from the burns and skin sloughing from my face. And it was almost like it took 10 days for that question to be answered. And the answer was, I know you're confused. I know you're hurting, and I'm with you. I got you. And, it was, I know God can handle the anger. But today I break a shoelace, and sometimes I feel like I'm just as mad, So I say, can you give me some credit for back in 1976? But yeah, up until that moment, 10 days felt like forever. But I was trying to negotiate or trying to say, come on, I'm willing to listen. Just tell me why. and I'll do what you want me to do, but just give me some insight. And I'm not sure he gave me a whole lot of insight, but the double-edged sword is he gave me enough certainty to know, okay, I can trust. Just like I could say to my dad when he said, jump off the sideboard counter, I'll catch you. You can trust me, I'm your dad. And that was the feeling I had in that near-death experience. And the doctors kept saying, interesting, the director of the burn unit is a Christian. He's still alive, and I just celebrated his 91st birthday with him last fall. He would say, we don't know why God does some of the things he does, or whether he allows them, or whether we cause them, or we do know he's there when we need him, and he's the strength, that we need to get through the tough times. What a blessing that the surgeon running the unit in the burn unit was of that faith. But that feeling in the NDE was just like I had been screaming right up until the second I felt euphoria. That God, you must take me. I cannot survive this. Feeling the resident next to me lifting my arm off the table, excuse me, and blood dripping to the floor, and the skin being peeled from my abdomen, and the pain just unbearable. And again, saying, I can't stand one more second, and one more second would carry on. But then all of a sudden, the sense that I'm in a recliner and just floating up toward this nice, soft, warm light, as though I were laying on a beach and my eyes are closed and I could see that light on the other side of my lids, and this comfort and the warmth and safety, the feeling that I'm forgiven and I'm loved and it's okay and we're going to get through this. And it was just, other people and NDE conferences I've been to, people's experiences have included very accurate descriptions of loved ones and their features. I don't remember seeing mom or my brother the way I saw them here on earth, but I saw them. And it wasn't, I was comfortable in the dynamic and the relationship. It's like they're there and they're with me in every decision I'm making, and they're equally present. And I had no problem with it. It wasn't like I'm sitting there going, wait, I don't see you like I did yesterday at the swimming pool. That just wasn't an issue. I kind of liken it to, my wife often wonders if those close to us who claim to be atheist, will they have the opportunity to change their mind at a certain time, or will we miss them if they're not in heaven? And I know that won't be a concern. And those in whose theology I trust most, I mean, I do feel that those things that we think we'll miss here on earth just won't be issues. And that's kind of the way it felt. Whether I see my mom again ever face to face. In Randy's book, he talks about playing golf in heaven. Will my golf clubs look the same? I don't know. But I won't have a problem if they're not Titleist, or if they're not, Arnie Palmer. It's just those kind of issues weren't there, but the overwhelming feeling and sense was that everything is the way it's always been, and it's just the way it's supposed to be, and it's always going to be the way it's supposed to be. God's got it all covered, and yet everything's so simple. I kept being amazed at of course. I know in the book I said one time, I wrote, oh my God, I thought, and I went, literally. Didn't recognize the pun the first time, but it was just as he said, just as we've been told from day one. And I've also said it felt as every question that could possibly come to mind, I didn't even have to ask. The answers came as fast as I could think. And so hard to put into words. Just the security, the secure, safe, certain, nurturing, loving, forgiving, it's all there in one. But a euphoria that I can't put into words. When John interviewed me, and he pointed out a quote, and I must have said somewhere in another interview, I said, it's really difficult to put into words. And then right after that, almost indescribable, as if it wasn't redundant, but I can't be redundant enough on that one.
Yeah, that is one of the things Randy and I hear over and over again is we just the words that we have don't do
Don't
justice
do it.
to
Right.
really capture the experience. And so many of the things you described, just on the one hand, we're as when we're on the other side in the presence of God. A lot of people will say, "Well, when I get to heaven, I need to know this, and I've got all these questions." It's so common for people to say, "I didn't care. Like I just not only
Mm-hmm.
did I not need to ask questions." I just had an understanding. I knew my questions were just answered. You just
Right.
know there's this spirit to spirit or thought to thought communication that just takes place, and there's this understanding that again, another thing that I think is very very difficult for us to describe. In terms of the experience, did you have a sense that you were going to be coming back, or like what did that look like for you?
I that many have said, like, was it my decision? Did God say this isn't your time yet, or did I decide there's still things I want to do? Wait a minute, God, I haven't seen my grandchildren yet, let alone my children at age 16. Um, but it was more like, for me, like there had been a huge board meeting where everyone who mattered was present, and every issue related to this decision or this answer was discussed and beaten like a dead horse. I understood now wasn't my time, and it wasn't like I decided, God decided, or mom, or I knew my dad needed me, and that I remember that being a strong sense that he it was going to be difficult. Recovery would not be easy, but there were other things I had to do in life still, and good things. Um, so it wouldn't be all work and sadness. But then I later found out that when I started losing massive amounts of blood, the doctors, I knew I was aware, but not the exact words, but they had gone out to talk with my dad and say, we're losing blood from his rectum. It's probably a Curling's ulcer, which is where the stomach lining ulcerates from the trauma and the surge of adrenaline. But dad said, full court press. I mean, I cannot lose my son and my wife and now my oldest son. And you've got to save them. And I had this sense that he and I were both going to have some challenges ahead, um, for sure, without mom. That was an unawareness. I was not going to heaven yet. I was not dying yet. I was going to be back here on this earth without mom, and I was going to be helping dad and my brothers in some way. Um, and that's kind of what I shared with dad later that night. It was 11 or something before I got back into the burn unit, but um, a long day. But it was an awareness definitely that seems like everybody was a part of. But again, one of those things that you just don't question. That's the way it is. Um,
And I'd love to hear as on the one hand, between the writing journey of putting this book together, and as you look back, what would you say is that the ongoing impact for you of that experience on the other side? Because on the one hand, I could say, well, just you had a lot of trauma and things to overcome that were going to change you regardless, on this side of the journey. But as I've found talking to so many different people who've had these afterlife encounters and heaven experiences, their personality shifts. There's just things about them that are marked by their time on the other side, their time in heaven. Um, is there anything as you reflect that you can point to that dramatically shifted in your personality or who you are?
Definitely, I frequently speak of it like a double-edged sword, because I right away return to the same mortal that I've always been, with the same kinds of confusion, but yet had a certainty that he has the answers, even if I don't know what they are, and that is the one truth that we can all rely on. So that certain knowledge that his is the one true story, Jesus is the one true savior, and that's the one true way to heaven. That's absolutely certain. Whereas on the other side of the sword is the want or desire to scream, God, why this shoelace too in the same day? Really? You know, I'm still that same guy who can get just as angry and escalate a molehill into a mountain. But I'm also the guy who, remember, oh yeah. And because I'm 100% sure that God is with me. He's not giving me any advantages to skate through any more easily, just because of that experience. But he has given me a certainty that I can share, and you know, and I think that's reassuring. It is. I know it has been for my loved ones and my kids, and my appreciation for the more important things in life is without a doubt greater than it ever could have been otherwise. Absolutely. It's just certain things just don't matter, and our time here is so finite and so minuscule and so relatively microscopic compared to eternity that I can't worry about those little things. That doesn't make me any less human though, because I still do it. um, it's a process, as we know, um, and it changed me in the sense too that as soon as I start thinking that my will and God's are in sync, I'm playing God again. I'm starting to think I know and I don't. Now, I thank God for that ignorance going through medical school and residency because it was so hard. I thought, okay, God, but you're with me and this is your will too, right? And whether I heard an answer or not, in my mind, it was enough to keep me pushing forward or persevering, which is my my big soapbox these days is, we don't know why. And even when we think we do, that's just our ego trying to remind us to keep moving forward, persevere, take the next step. And he's always been there. And I also don't say um, that you can't be in fear and faith at the same time. A lot of people in recovery circles like to say that. I think they both reside in very close proximity because I do know from past experiences that this next lesson could be a struggle. It could be painful, and I can have some reasonable fear about it. At the same time, though, I can also be comforted and chill, certain in the knowledge that God will provide whatever I need. And Romans 8:28 tells me, and my wife constantly reminds me, yeah, he can even make good from this too. On a bad day. That's just me defining it as bad because tomorrow I'm going to see yesterday as, wow, that was a really positive thing. But if I can stay open-minded to that, that's the true plus that came from the experience. Whether that's a handicap or an asset, I'm not sure.
How you feel about that might vary on the day. I think the place I'd love to move towards kind of landing the interview as we wrap up is just having you share a little bit about why you ended up deciding to become a reconstructive surgeon. Because you kind of alluded to this earlier that some people might wonder how could you even be in that situation? Wouldn't that be traumatic and triggering to be in that space where you experience kind of the horrors of what you went through? I'd just love to hear a little bit about why did this become the path for your journey?
Um, I always thought surgery and medicine were cool. I mean, even the frightening experiences as a child, as much as they were scary, it was pretty cool, and I was in pretty awe, and it was pretty like awe-inspiring that all these doctors and people in the white coats with the silver shiny instruments and all that stuff. The older I got, the more I thought surgery was cool, but I was also had some experiences volunteering even during high school with other survivors, and they were very positive experiences, and I was reinforced to feel like, gee, I can share some of my stories and how I got through stuff. It not only helps me, but it helps them. I learned that very thinking was reinforced in the recovery networks. I mean, it's the only way we can get anything is by giving back. So the experiences I had as a physical therapist too were sometimes to go into the operating room and put splints on a patient. I'd see more of the surgical operations and that kind of thing. And so I wanted to do that cool technical stuff. But I also felt like I can do it better than some of the not so good ones that I encountered. Even back in the burn unit, I remember seeing residents who were probably overworked, and cranky, saying, "Well, I would be real nice and pleasant with all my patients all the time, and I can do this job better." So, were like it or not, I had some sense that I knew a little bit. Maybe I should look into it. And with each day, I got more and more interested. And I loved the surgery part of what I did because you could do something that was straightforward, made intuitive and practical sense, and correct a problem or make a problem better. So I knew once I got into medicine, I wanted to do surgery. And then reconstructive surgery was just, I thought of plastic surgery like a lot of people, that it's all about cosmetics and making people prettier. But it's also about making people prettier after unforeseeable circumstances made them ugly. And that was the experience I shared with the young guy on the beach. And when I knew that reconstructive surgery could make functional difference, well, that was right in line with what I'd learned through all my years as a physical therapist. It was always about getting people back to function and helping them then share those experiences with their, encounters. But that's been always to this day. And we say it all the time in recovery. It's a selfish motive behind helping another. I mean, it helps me with my issues when I can reach out and share my struggles or my experience, strength, and hope, as they say in recovery networks. That's without a doubt been tested time and time again and proven. If we could all keep that mindset, I think Jesus would be really happy, huh?
One last place I want to go before we wrap up. This just struck me so much in the book. Talk to us about those first ice chips, the first water
Oh,
you were
yeah.
able to get when you were in the hospital. I just the descriptive nature of how you shared that part of your story I was just taken with that. Well, just tell that
I,
to the
I
audience.
love water. I always have. And if Scorpio's a water sign, I know Aquarius certainly, but water in any shape or form. And I've noticed it as time has gone on, looking back in life, some of my happiest times, water's related in one way or another. Um, I love steam rooms. We're building a steam room in this house we just moved into because it's the most incredibly pleasant, serene, relaxing modality I know of. But um, right, becoming conscious in the ambulance, and in addition to knowing or wanting to know what happened with Toby and my mom, the thought never left my mind that I am dying of thirst, and even more so than pain. I just wanted so badly to have a sip of water. And this is true for anybody in shock. And I was in the biggest, quickest kind of shock you can get into, having lost all that fluid that stimulates every mechanism in the brain that says you got to put fluid in. But they can't give it to you orally because you can aspirate into the lungs, and then that's the end. So I was, as they say in medicine, NPO, which is Latin for nothing by mouth, for days. And all I could think about was that sip of water, that first sip. Oh my gosh. And that's literally what it was, 30 cc's of fluid, but it started in the form of ice. So it would melt slowly into 30 cc's. And 30 cc's is like a shot, an ounce. And the first ice cubes on the tip of my tongue, I remember curling my tongue into a trough so they would just sit there. And I remember the smell and the aroma of the minerals in the water, the frozen water, and just cherishing every second that ice was in there. And then that was the one wonderful thing I could look forward to that became my hope. Yeah, years later, when I saw the movie Shawshank Redemption, I remember having a discussion with a friend about what hope was. And for Andy, it was that letter and that promise that he'd give some instructions buried by a tree and a road down that was the hope that his buddy needed to hang on to. And for me, it was a hope that I could eat again normally someday, or, drink fluids. But that little ice cube turned into 30 cc's on the hour, and then 60 cc's, and clear liquid diet advanced to a soft to a full. But mine was intermittently interrupted by having to be on and off a ventilator. So you can't take her fluids then either. But my gosh, to this day, that I will work sometimes in the hot sun an hour longer than anybody would recommend, because that refreshing quenching of the thirst is so enjoyable. I'll mow one more part of the yard, then I'll get that. It's to this day a huge thing with me. But I don't know if that's what you're referring
No,
to.
I loved how you described it, and just I think in the book you talk about how just that the scent or that aroma of ice from an ice machine, like that
Yeah.
still stays with you
And the plastic
to this
spoon,
day.
even,
Yeah.
you can smell the plastic. Yeah.
Well, and yeah, as we wrap up, I always like to ask every author in terms of the reader's journey with the book. Like, what's the message you hope somebody hears loud and clear? Because with a story like yours, and we've kind of alluded to this, like in a straight up near death experience story, I always feel like people fixate on some specific element. Oh, they saw this in heaven, or they encountered that. But I feel like with your story, as we've talked about, there's so many things I think people could potentially relate to depending on their own journey. But for you, when somebody encounters this book and your story, what's that takeaway? What do you hope every single person hears from your story?
Well, I hope to hear the truth. I mean, I see people sometimes, not in any particular service or church, that are just so over the top giddy about our life in God's world. And I don't think God ever said it was going to be that way, all laughs and smiles. And so it's okay to share your struggles. It's okay to share your pain. You know, uh, from the time in the garden, we knew it was going to be not an easy one. Child rearing and tilling the soil are going to be difficult, but we can help each other, and God can always provide us with the strength we need that we don't have. There's nothing good in this world that's come without God, or any other way, and there's nothing I can do without His strength or on my own. And I learn that more and more every day. So the take home from the NDE and right to my continued pursuit of Him and His standard, He sets that standard. But I'll know I'll never reach it. But without Him, and if I don't stay open to Him, I won't even try to reach it. I'll lose hope. I'll become blind. That's my big fear, that I shut down or close my heart, because it's so good when it's open.
And Mark, for the listeners and viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the book, all the things, where do we discover you on the web?
drmarkmcd.com, or the Phoenix Doc, phoenixdoc.com, or phoenixdot.net, and all those other dots.
And like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. We'll have links in the show notes to Mark's website, as well as places where you can pick up your very own copy of his excellent book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Mark McDonough. Once again, our book today was Forged Through Fire, a reconstructive surgeon's story of survival, faith, and healing. And Mark, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Shaun. It's been mine as well. I appreciate it so much.